Once upon a time, in a small village nestled on the edge of a vast and ancient forest, there lived a young girl known as Little Red Riding Hood. She earned the name for the bright crimson cloak she wore everywhere, a gift lovingly sewn by her grandmother. The cloak, her grandmother said, would protect her from the cold and keep her safe from harm. Red was known for her adventurous spirit and bright smile, but she was also known for her bravery, or recklessness, depending on who you asked. The forest, known as the Darkwood, was a place of fear and mystery for the villagers. It was said to be home to many things: wild beasts, restless spirits, and ancient curses. Most people avoided it unless they had no other choice. But Red had traveled its narrow paths many times to visit her grandmother, who lived in a small cottage on the forest's edge. One day, as the autumn leaves fell in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Red's mother handed her a basket filled with bread, cheese, and fresh berries. "Your grandmother hasn't been feeling well," her mother said, tying the basket handle with a sturdy knot. "Take this to her and keep her company. But mind the path, Red. Don't stray, no matter what you see." "I won't stray," Red promised. Her mother hesitated, brushing a strand of Red's auburn hair from her face. "And if you see the wolf, you run. Don't talk to it. Don't listen to it. Just run. Do you understand?" Red laughed lightly, though her mother's tone made her uneasy. "The wolf doesn't scare me, Mama. I've never even seen it." Her mother's face remained grave. "You don't need to see it for it to see you. Promise me, Red." "I promise," Red said, though a part of her felt her mother was being overly cautious. Wolves were just animals, after all, weren't they? With that, she tied her red cloak tightly around her shoulders, picked up the basket, and set off toward the forest. The forest seemed to swallow her whole as she entered it, the towering trees forming a canopy so dense that only faint shafts of light reached the forest floor. The air was cooler here, damp and heavy with the scent of moss and fallen leaves. Red had always liked the forest. There was something peaceful about its quiet stillness. But today, the silence felt wrong, as though it were listening. As she walked, Red tried to keep her spirits up. She hummed softly to herself, the tune blending with the crunch of her boots on the dirt path. The basket swung lightly at her side, its contents shifting with every step. But as she ventured deeper, her unease grew. The trees seemed taller than she remembered, their twisted branches stretching like bony fingers overhead. Shadows danced in her peripheral vision, and though she told herself it was only the wind, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Red paused at a clearing where wildflowers used to bloom in springtime. Now it was overrun with blackened weeds, the earth scorched in strange patterns. Nearby, an old oak bore deep claw marks, the grooves far too wide and jagged to be from any animal she could name. She quickened her pace, but the path seemed narrower now, the trees pressing closer together. Every so often, she thought she heard whispers, soft and fleeting, just at the edge of hearing. Then she saw it. From the shadows ahead, a pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged. The wolf stepped into view, its massive form blending seamlessly with the gloom of the forest. Its fur was dark as midnight, its muscles rippling as it moved with a predator's grace. Red's heart skipped a beat as the wolf stopped in the middle of the path, its eyes fixed on her. "Hello, little one," the wolf said, its voice low and smooth, like a rumble of thunder. Red's grip tightened on the basket. "Wolves don't talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The wolf tilted its head, its sharp teeth glinting as it grinned. "Oh, but I do." It began to circle her slowly, its eyes never leaving hers. Red forced herself to stay still, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" the wolf asked, its tone almost casual. "To my grandmother's cottage," Red replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The wolf stopped, its grin fading. "Your grandmother, is it?" It sniffed the air, its nose wrinkling slightly. "Do you even know what she is?" Red frowned. "What are you talking about?" The wolf's expression darkened. "She isn't what you think she is. Turn back now, little one, and you might live to see tomorrow." Fear coiled in Red's stomach, but she forced herself to glare at the wolf. "You're lying," she said. "You just want to scare me." The wolf's golden eyes narrowed, and for a moment, his voice softened. "You don't understand what's waiting for you. If you go to her, you'll never leave." Red's breath quickened, but she clenched her fists. "Stay away from me," she shouted. The wolf growled, its lips pulling back to reveal its sharp teeth. "You'll regret this," it said before retreating into the shadows. Red didn't wait to see where it went. She ran, her cloak billowing behind her, and didn't stop until her grandmother's cottage came into view. The cottage looked different than Red remembered. The garden, once neat and full of flowers, was overgrown with tangled vines and blackened stalks. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Grandmother!" Red called as she stepped inside. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, shifting subtly as though alive. Her grandmother sat by the fire, her face half hidden in shadow. "Ah, my sweet girl," her grandmother said, her voice warm, but with an edge that made Red shiver. "Come closer. Let me see you." As Red approached, her unease deepened. Her grandmother's skin looked stretched too tight over her bones, her eyes glinting like polished glass. "You've grown so lovely," her grandmother said, smiling wide. "And that cloak, it suits you perfectly." Outside, the wolf howled, its voice desperate and piercing. Red jumped, clutching her basket. "Don't worry about that beast," her grandmother said sharply. "It's been trying to get in for days, but it can't hurt you here, my darling." The wolf's voice cut through the silence. "Red! Let me in! She'll devour you!" Red's grandmother's smile faltered for a split second before she said, "You see how desperate it is to trick you? Wolves are clever, my dear. Never trust them." Red hesitated, torn between the wolf's warnings and her grandmother's reassuring tone. "Bolt the door, child," her grandmother said softly, "and come sit by the fire. You must be tired from your journey." Trembling, Red did as she was told, locking the wolf outside. Its howls turned to anguished cries, then silence. Her grandmother smiled again, her teeth seeming sharper now. "Good girl, now, come closer." Red sat by the fire, her hands wrapped tightly around the basket in her lap. The flames crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows across the cottage walls. Something about the room felt wrong, as though it were too small, too suffocating, and watching her too closely. Her grandmother's eyes gleamed in the dim light as she leaned forward. "You've always been such a good girl," she said softly. "So obedient, so trusting. You've grown strong, haven't you? Red blinked, startled by the odd question. I suppose so, she replied hesitantly. I helped Mama around the house. Her grandmother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I can tell. You're brimming with life, my dear. It's written all over you. That's why I gave you that cloak. Do you know what it's for? Red frowned, her unease growing. You gave it to me to keep me warm, she said slowly. Her grandmother chuckled, a low, rasping sound that sent a chill down Red's spine. That's part of it, she said. But not all. Red's fingers tightened around the basket. What do you mean? Her grandmother's smile stretched unnaturally wide. That cloak binds you to me, child. It marks you, protects you, until the time is right. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and the firelight flickered as though struggling to stay alive. Red's heart began to race. Grandmother, she said, her voice trembling. You're scaring me. Her grandmother's eyes glinted, and her voice dropped to a low, almost guttural tone. Am I, my sweet? Don't be afraid. This has always been your purpose. You're the last of the line, the strongest of them all. Do you think I let your mother go because I loved her? No, Red. She was too weak. But you are perfect. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing down on Red's chest. She tried to stand, but her legs felt leaden, her body sluggish. What are you talking about? She whispered. Her grandmother rose from the chair, her movements sharp and unnatural. As she stepped into the firelight, Red gasped. Her grandmother's face was no longer kind. Her skin was pale and tall, veins dark against the surface. Her hands were bony claws, her nails sharp as knives, and her teeth, jagged and blackened, gleaming with a predatory hunger. You betrayed the wolf, her grandmother hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. The only creature that could have saved you. Red's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. The wolf had been warning her, trying to protect her, but she had locked it out. You lied to me, Red whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that filled the room. Of course I lied. What did you think I was, child? An old woman in need of your pity? No, my dear, I'm so much more than that. Dark tendrils began to creep across the floor, writhing like living shadows. They snaked toward Red, wrapping around her ankles and pulling her to the ground. She screamed, thrashing against the invisible force, but it was no use. The wolf's howl pierced the air, and the window shattered as it leapt into the room, its massive form landing between Red and her grandmother. You! The witch snarled, her voice filled with rage. You've interfered for the last time. The wolf growled, its fur bristling, and lunged at her. The two clashed in a violent blur of claws and teeth, shadow and fur. The witch conjured dark tendrils that lashed out like whips, but the wolf was relentless, snapping and tearing at her with savage fury. Red lay on the floor, paralyzed with fear, as the battle raged around her. Her grandmother's voice filled the room, a chilling blend of rage and glee. You think you can save her? She spat. She is mine. The wolf turned its golden eyes to Red. Run! It growled. But Red didn't run. Terror clouded her judgment. And when she saw the wolf's gleaming teeth and bloodied fur, she made a terrible mistake. She reached for the fire poker by the hearth and with shaking hands swung it at the wolf. The metal struck its side with a sickening crack, and the wolf let out a pained yelp, staggering back. "No!" the wolf cried, its voice filled with despair. The witch laughed, her shadowy tendrils wrapping around the wolf and lifting it into the air. "Foolish girl," she hissed, turning to Red. "You've doomed yourself." The wolf struggled weakly against the tendrils, its golden eyes meeting Red's one last time. "You'll never escape," it rasped before the shadows consumed it entirely. The witch turned her attention back to Red, her grin widening. "Now, my dear, where were we?" The shadows dragged Red into the center of the room, binding her arms and legs. She screamed, but no sound escaped her throat. The witch loomed over her, her skeletal hands glowing with a sickly green light. "You'll make a fine wolf," the witch said, her voice dripping with triumph. "Stronger than the last. You'll serve me well." Red's body convulsed as the spell took hold. Her fingers lengthened into claws. Her teeth sharpened, and fur sprouted from her skin. Pain ripped through her as her bones shifted and reformed, her screams turning into guttural howls. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the witch's triumphant smile. When Red awoke, she was no longer in the cottage. She was in a cage deep in the forest, the bars made of twisting black roots that pulsed with a life of their own. Around her, other wolves paced in their cages, their eyes dull and lifeless. She tried to cry out, but only a low, mournful howl escaped her throat. Her body was no longer her own. Her limbs felt foreign, her senses sharper and wilder. The witch's voice echoed through the trees. "Run, my little wolves. Hunt for me. Bring me their blood, and I will let you live another day." The cage door creaked open, and Red stumbled out, her paws sinking into the cold earth. She felt the pull of the witch's magic, dragging her forward. Somewhere in the distance, a human voice called her name, faint and desperate. But it was too late. Little Red Riding Hood was no more. She threw back her head and howled, the sound carrying through the forest, joined by the cries of the other wolves. And deep in the shadows, the witch smiled. Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.